stood at the mailbox again. 4th time this week. I told myself I was just checking for bills, but we both know that's a lie. I was waiting for the envelope, the one with the crimson seal. I had dreamt of it since I was 12. Harvard. I triple-checked the mailbox, ran my fingers along the back just in case something was wedged. Nothing. When I stepped back inside, my mother looked up from her tea and said, "Still chasing fantasies." Her words were dipped in condescension, like I was a child pretending to be a queen. My father didn't even look up from the news. That silence. It was louder than any insult. I told myself maybe the letter was delayed. Maybe it got lost. But 3 weeks passed. Then, one evening, I went to grab a sweater from the laundry room, and there it was. Stuffed behind the dryer, bent and dusty, the Harvard envelope. My heart dropped. My hands shook. It had been opened, torn, read, hidden. I stared at it, trying to breathe. And that's when I realized it wasn't Harvard that had rejected me. It was them. I walked into the living room holding the letter like it was radioactive. My hands trembled, but my voice didn't. "You open this." My mother didn't blink. She took another sip of her tea and said, "You weren't ready. That's all. Not even denial." My father folded his paper with a sigh, like my pain was an inconvenience. "We did it for your own good," he said, not looking at me. I wanted to scream, to tear the room apart, but I didn't. I just stood there, still and silent, while everything inside me cracked. My sister, always the golden one, always so perfect, walked in, saw the envelope, and smirked. "Oh, you found it." No apology, no remorse, just casual cruelty. That's when I understood something brutal. They didn't believe in me. Not because I wasn't smart enough, but because me leaving meant they'd lose control. I was never meant to outgrow them. I was supposed to stay small, obedient, invisible. But now I held proof that the world saw something in me that they refused to. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I waited until the house was asleep, then pulled out the small suitcase I'd hidden under my bed, the one I'd filled months ago with dreams I wasn't allowed to speak of. I folded the acceptance letter neatly and tucked it inside a book. Then I packed the essentials: 2 outfits, my worn-out sneakers, a tiny notebook I called my escape plan, and enough cash I'd saved from tutoring and babysitting to get me across the country. No goodbyes, no note, just silence. As I closed the zipper, I looked around my room, at the walls that had heard every insult, every dismissal, every "know your place." I wasn't running away. I was walking towards something bigger, something mine. At dawn, I slipped out the front door. The air was cold, but I felt alive. I didn't know how I'd get there. I just knew I would. That morning, the girl they underestimated disappeared, and the woman they feared began her journey. The bus station smelled like old coffee and desperation, but to me, it was freedom. I clutched my ticket like it was gold. Boston. One way. People around me looked tired, worn down, silent. But I felt like I was breathing for the first time. I had nothing but a dream and a letter, and that was enough. The ride took nearly 2 days. I slept curled up against the window, used my hoodie as a pillow, and rationed granola bars like they were gourmet meals. No one asked where I was going. No one cared. That anonymity. It felt like power. On the second morning, the skyline came into view. Cold, crisp, majestic. Boston. I stared out at the city I had only seen in photos and late-night fantasies. My chest swelled with something unnameable. Not pride, not fear. Something deeper. I didn't have a dorm room. No student ID yet. No plan beyond that letter in my bag. But I had something they could never take. The fire to rise, no matter who tried to bury me. The gates of Harvard stood before me like something out of a dream. Tall, ornate, intimidating. I walked up to the admissions building with my letter in hand, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The woman at the desk looked up with mild curiosity. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. "No," I whispered. "But I have a letter." I handed it to her, half expecting security to appear, to be laughed out the door. She read it slowly, then looked up. Her brows lifted, just slightly. "You were accepted," she said, "but you never responded." I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. She studied me, the oversized backpack, the worn-out shoes, the desperation barely hidden behind my polite smile. Then, instead of questions, she picked up the phone, called someone. Minutes later, a man in a tweed blazer walked in, nodded to her, and said gently, "Come with me." And just like that, the gates didn't feel so heavy anymore. Maybe, just maybe, I belonged. They led me to a quiet office with high ceilings and shelves filled with dusty books. The man introduced himself as Dr. Ellison, Dean of Admissions. He didn't ask why I'd vanished after being accepted. He simply said, "Tell me what happened." And I did. Not all at once, not dramatically, just pieces. A missing letter. A family that never believed in me. A suitcase packed in silence. I expected skepticism, maybe pity. But he just nodded, like he'd heard variations of this before. "You still want this?" he asked. "Yes," I breathed. No hesitation. He tapped a few keys on his computer. "The semester started 2 weeks ago. But if you're willing to work harder than anyone else, we can make room." I nodded, tears stinging behind my eyes. That night, I stayed in a dormitory overflow room. No roommate, just a mattress, a desk, and a radiator that made ghost noises. But it was mine. I sat on the floor with my knees to my chest, holding the letter like scripture. I didn't need revenge. I needed proof that I existed outside of them. And this was it. The first weeks were brutal. I had no textbooks, no meal plan, no mentor, just borrowed notes, secondhand coffee, and sleepless nights. I worked part-time at a nearby diner, bussing tables until my fingers ached, then studied in the back booth until dawn. Harvard wasn't a dream anymore. It was war. But every time I felt like quitting, I remembered my mother's voice saying, "You weren't ready." I wrote that sentence on a Post-it and stuck it inside my notebook. It became fuel. I lived in the library. Sometimes I didn't even leave. One night, long after midnight, I stood alone among the stacks and whispered to the silence, "I will not disappear." No one heard it, but I did. And that mattered. I wasn't just surviving. I was rising. Quietly. Slowly. Like smoke through cracks they never thought I'd escape. And the thing about silence? It builds pressure. Until one day, it becomes a roar. By the middle of the semester, something shifted. Professors started remembering my name. Classmates, the ones who had once looked past me, now turned to me for answers. I wasn't the loudest in the room, but I was always prepared, always listening. I got invited to a study group, then to a research assistant role. Small things, quiet victories. I still wore the same worn jacket and lived off instant noodles, but I carried myself differently. I had earned that space. One afternoon, I walked into a seminar room, one reserved for the elite, the legacy students. The air was thick with entitlement. I took a seat at the back, unnoticed. But when the professor asked a question no one could answer, I spoke. Clear, precise, confident. The room fell silent, then heads turned. Eyes widened. One girl, polished and perfect, looked at me and muttered, "Who is she?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, I wasn't just there. I belonged. One night, I saw the name flash across my screen. Mom. Just that. No message, just the missed call. I stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering. I imagined what she'd say. That they missed me. That things were different now. That maybe I could come home for the holidays. But I didn't need to hear her voice to know the tone. She'd still be wearing that same armor of superiority, polished by years of condescension. And I wasn't the same girl anymore. I let the phone go dark. Instead, I opened my laptop and submitted my paper. The one on resilience, autonomy, and identity. A piece born not from textbooks, but from survival. I didn't block the number. I didn't reply either. Some silences say more than screams. That night, I sat by my dorm window, watching snow fall over the city. And I whispered, not to them, but to myself. You did this, not in spite of them, but without them. And somehow, that felt even more powerful. That spring, I received an invitation to the annual Dean's Dinner, a formal event reserved for top-performing students. I borrowed a blazer from the Lost, and found, fixed my hair with borrowed gel, and wore a pair of shoes held together with superglue and hope. The banquet hall glittered with chandeliers and polished ambition. Legacy kids brought their parents, lawyers, surgeons, senators. I walked in alone, and I held my head high. When the dean stepped up to the podium and began listing names, mine came third. A student who arrived late, but has since become one of the top in her department. Applause followed. I smiled, but I didn't cry. I had shed all those tears in silence long ago. As I looked around, I realized something. I wasn't the only one without family there, but I was the only one whose absence of applause from home didn't sting, because I wasn't waiting for their approval anymore. I had my own voice now, and it echoed louder than theirs ever did. During finals week, a professor pulled me aside after class. "There's an alum looking for a research assistant for the summer," he said. "I gave him your name." I blinked, stunned. "Harvard Law, full stipend. It's competitive, but I think you're ready." I thanked him, hands shaking, heart thundering. The interview was in a sleek office overlooking the Charles River. I wore my thrifted blazer again, brushed off the lint, and walked in like I belonged. The interviewer, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, asked about my background. I didn't lie. I didn't dramatize. I told her I got here on grit and chance. When I finished, she leaned back, smiled slightly, and said, "You remind me of myself." That afternoon, I got the call. Accepted. Fully funded. Prestigious. I sat on the steps of the library, phone in hand, watching the students rush past. I should have called someone to celebrate. But instead, I closed my eyes and smiled to no one, because I had become the person they tried to erase. And that was everything. Summer came, and with it, a choice I never thought I'd make. I went home, not out of nostalgia, but to prove to myself that I no longer belonged to that version of me. I stood at the front door of the house where I'd been silenced, belittled, ignored. My mother answered, surprised, but not pleased. "So, you're back," she said, arms crossed. "Just passing through," I replied. My father was in his usual chair, older but just as distant. My sister glanced up from her phone, expression unreadable. I didn't sit. I didn't explain. I told them where I'd been, what I'd done. Harvard, the award, the fellowship. The silence that followed wasn't disappointment. It was disbelief. And I realized They hadn't changed. But I had. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need a hug. I needed only one thing: to leave on my own terms. So I turned, opened the door, and left without waiting for permission. The girl who once begged to be seen had become the woman who no longer asked. Back at campus, I sat alone in the courtyard where I used to read between classes. I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and began writing. Not an essay, not a resume, but a letter to the girl I used to be. You will feel invisible. You will feel unworthy. But one day, you will walk through the very halls they said you'd never enter. You will sit in rooms where your name is spoken with respect. You will speak without shaking. You will laugh without shrinking. The pen moved faster than my thoughts. I poured it all out. The fear, the shame, the quiet triumphs. I didn't write to send it. I wrote to remember. Because in a world that tried so hard to silence me, I had learned to be my own witness. When I folded the letter and placed it inside my journal, I didn't cry. I simply breathed. Deeply. Fully. I wasn't chasing approval anymore. I was building a life. One step. One silence. One unapologetic breath at a time. Senior year. I was invited to speak at a student panel on resilience and leadership. My name was printed on the program, right there in bold, beside students whose parents had funded buildings. I walked onto that stage in a black dress I'd saved up for all semester. No designer tag, just elegance earned. The room was full. Professors, alumni, first years who still looked a little lost. I shared my story, not the dramatic version, just the truth. About a girl whose letter was stolen. About a bus ride that changed everything. About the silent climb from invisibility to presence. When I finished, the applause was long, but one face stood out. A girl in the front row, maybe 16, clenching her notebook like it was armor. Eyes wide. I saw myself in her. And for the first time, I understood. This wasn't just my victory. It was a mirror. A door cracked open for someone else. That was the real revenge, not spite, not proving them wrong, but becoming someone others could believe in. Graduation day arrived under a sky so blue it felt unreal. My name echoed through the loudspeakers. I walked across the stage slowly, every step a memory. Of the laundry room where I found the hidden letter, of the overnight buses, the cafeteria jobs, the sleepless nights in the library. The diploma was placed in my hands. Not just paper, not just proof. It was a quiet scream. A monument to everything I had endured without applause. I didn't scan the crowd for familiar faces. I knew they weren't there. And I didn't need them to be. As the tassel shifted sides, I closed my eyes and exhaled. Deep, final, free. I walked off that stage not as a daughter who had something to prove, but as a woman who had already proven everything that mattered, not to them, to me. And in that silence, beneath the roar of celebration, I smiled. Because I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I rose. Thank you for watching until the end. If you've ever lived through something similar, if you've been underestimated, silenced, or told to shrink, share your story in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the loudest impact is made in silence.